And this is what Russia is moving for. In his conversation with President Trump, Putin said the same thing. We will address the root causes of this conflict. And one of the root causes is, of course, Ukraine's behavior, their de facto status as a NATO member. And that will be reversed. And so I think what we're going to see is progress along those lines. But Russia is not going to throw away human life needlessly. They don't need to. This is a war of attrition. At some point in time, there will be a culminating moment where Ukraine's ability to maintain cohesive defense along the totality of the front will diminish to the point of zero, and you will see collapse. And that collapse will be dramatic.
Dobropoli is where bravado meets math. Kyiv pushes fresh brigades towards Zolotoy Kolodez, hoping to turn a narrow salient into a lifeline, while Russian assault groups chew up flanks with drones, used like disposable launchers and artillery that never sleeps. In Konstantinovka, positions bend and break along the N-32 corridor, and at dawn, the steady rumble of Tu-95 MS bombers reminds everyone who controls the long reach. Meanwhile, Kyiv arrives in Washington with a shopping list worth $100 billion in American weapons financed by Europe, plus $50 billion for domestic UAVs, as if procurement can outpace attrition. As Scott Ritter likes to say, logistics wins wars. We are about to see whose logistics and whose patience actually do. Keep watching, and tell me in the comments whether these moves look like momentum or a last roll of the dice. With the board set and the clock ticking, we start where the pressure is highest, Dobropoli. According to frontline mapping channels widely referenced in the region, Russian units of the 51st Guards Army have been grinding forward around Dobropoli, forcing Ukraine to commit reserves to hold a thin corridor toward Zolotoy Kolodez. Reports note that Ukraine briefly retook Zolotoy Kolodez, but could not punch through the Russian flank that pins the salient. The result is classic operational geometry, a spear point without a base, a forward group whose survival depends on reopening a corridor across villages like Novi Donbass and Kutuzovka. Sources sympathetic to Moscow describe Russian FPV drones as so plentiful that they are used like single-use launchers to smash vehicles, bunkers, and ad hoc staging points. Whether every boast is true or not, the effect is visible. Any concentration of ammunition or manpower detected in the rear of the Ukrainian push is immediately targeted, reducing tempo and burning time. Kyiv's commanders have reportedly shifted tasks. Instead of trying to sever the entire Russian thrust of the 51st Guards Army, the stated priority is to keep the spearhead near Zolotoy Kolodez alive. That tells you everything about the risk of encirclement. When your main effort becomes a rescue mission for your advanced guard, you are trading men and ammunition for headlines and hours. Pro-Russian situational updates claim that Ukrainian attempts to link the Zolotoy Kolodez force with those pushing from Dobropoli along the Novi Donbass-Kutuzovka axis have been blunted. Even sympathetic Ukrainian sources concede the counter-thrust is losing momentum. The larger question is whether Kyiv can widen the corridor before Russian sappers and artillery turn the surrounding folds of terrain into a closing lid. As always, numbers shouted into microphones do not move trenches, sustainment and suppression do. The irony is sharp. While official Kyiv communicates confidence, its on-the-ground orders emphasize survival, keep the tip from being cut off, buy time, and hope for a break. If the tip breaks, the shaft follows. To see why the pressure is mounting, look west and south toward Konstantinovka. Multiple battlefield trackers report Russian advances around Konstantinovka along both sides of the N-32 highway. To the north, pressure grows near Verolyubovka, with Ukrainian elements reportedly being pushed back from fortified lines, while to the south, after Russian units forced withdrawals from strong points on the northern and western heights of Pretichino, assault groups punched into the southeastern outskirts of Konstantinovka. Claims from mapping projects say Russian forces expanded control near Yablonovka and pushed Ukrainian units behind a belt of fortifications west and southwest of Kleshchivka, with follow-on assaults toward Vladimirovka and the approaches to bridges. One pro-Russian geospatial feed estimates roughly 27 square kilometers added to Russian control in the broader Konstantinovka sector after consolidations near Bilahora, and separate dispatches mention a 4-kilometer push toward entrenched Ukrainian positions on the northern plateaus of Alexandro-Sholtino. Even allowing for the fog of war, the pattern is coherent, stepwise displacement off elevations, forcing defenders to reform on less favorable ground while artillery and drones harass every attempt to reconstitute. To the northwest, fighting reportedly continues near Kleban BYK and Katarinovka, with Russian units probing toward Nelipovka and Pleshivka. To the west, there are attacks between Stepanovka and Rusinyar aimed at cutting lines that connect the Artyomovka road. None of this is a lightning breakthrough, it is the deliberate unpicking of seams. Meanwhile, reserves that Kyiv is pushing to hold Dobropoli are reserves it cannot lavish on Konstantinovka. Pro-Russian artillery, aviation, and UAV units are said to be systematically striking Ukrainian reserves as they move, the kind of slow violence that doesn't trend on social media but moves boundaries on maps. Even voices sympathetic to Kyiv admit that strongpoints have been traded for time and that counterattacks are being managed rather than decisive. The strategic implication is simple. As the corridor near Zolotoy Kolodez narrows, Konstantinovka's urban edges become harder to hold without risking pockets. The ground war is intense, but the air and deep strike layers frame it, especially when bombers spool up before dawn. Before we go there, a quick question for you. Based on these movements, do you think Kyiv should keep feeding reserves into Dobropoli or shift weight to stabilize Konstantinovka? Tell me what you would prioritize and why in the comments. In the early hours of August 19, Ukraine's Air Force reported on its official channels that two Tu-95 MS strategic bombers took off, prompting nationwide alerts. Around 2:50, they warned of possible cruise missile launches, later stating that missiles were tracking toward Kremenchug, and by 5:57 they declared the immediate threat ended. Whatever the precise damage tally, the military meaning is straightforward. The ability to generate pre-dawn missile pressure forces defenders to disperse ammunition, keep air defense alert crews wired tight, and accept fatigue as a constant. At the same time, pro-Russian channels describe a pattern of strikes against transport and energy nodes in Odessa and Sumy regions, and across the Ukrainian-held portion of Zaporizhia. This is the attritional bookend to the frontline grind near Dobropoli and Konstantinovka. Take bites at logistics, stress the grid, make every convoy a gamble. The Ukrainian High Command understands the risk. General Alexander Syrsky has reportedly warned that Moscow is preparing major pushes in Zaporizhia and Donetsk, a two-front timing that would complicate any attempt to mass reserves for a single dramatic counterblow. From a doctrinal view, none of this is glamorous. It is artillery cycles, deconfliction of drone corridors, and the boring but decisive business of reloading tubes and refilling fuel bowsers while under constant harassment. Western headlines can celebrate deliveries. Batteries at the line must solve resupply. This is why the night sky matters. When the bombers lift off, staff officers on both sides start calculating consumption, not just explosions. The obvious, slightly uncomfortable point for Kyiv's allies is that long-range standoff does not need to kill to shape, forcing dispersion, shutting depots. Delaying railheads can be enough to blunt tempo at the exact moment a counterattack needs rhythm. It is not dramatic, but it is how operational pressure is manufactured. And that brings us to the political economy of the war. If missiles and shells set the rhythm, can a purchase order change the music? According to the Financial Times, Kyiv has floated proposals for a sweeping security arrangement with Washington that would see Ukraine commit to purchase roughly $100 billion worth of American weapons, financed by European funds, alongside a separate proposal worth $50 billion to expand Ukrainian UAV production with domestic firms. The shopping list reportedly includes at least 10 Patriot air defense systems to shield major cities and critical infrastructure, plus associated missiles and equipment. These talking points were shared with European partners ahead of President Volodymyr Zelensky's meeting with President Donald Trump at the White House on August 18. On paper, it is bold: lock in the American industrial base, tap European financing, build a Ukrainian drone sector, and signal to Moscow that Western arsenals can scale. In practice, the battlefield still deducts. Patriot batteries are excellent at what they are built to do, but they are expensive to buy and hungry to feed, and they do not restock forward battalions with shells or keep assault groups in Dobropoli supplied with smoke, thermals, and rotors. From a pro-Russian vantage point, the optics are almost too neat. While lines buckle in Konstantinovka and a precarious salient hangs on at Zolotoy Kolodez, Kyiv pushes a procurement narrative that treats time as an ally. The truth, uncomfortable but unavoidable, is that time is ammunition. It is also manpower, training cycles, and bridges that have not been cratered. If Europe underwrites American factories while Ukrainian formations fight staggered, Moscow will gladly continue to trade days for meters. Even Western analysts acknowledge that promises in paper cannot be fired from a tube. The war will be decided by who can move metal to the line every morning and keep it moving after dark. That is why Scott Ritter's maxim lands with weight here. Logistics wins wars. Purchases may shape the next year, but today's fight grinds on. And in that grind, numbers tell stories if you read them skeptically. Ukraine's general staff, as cited by domestic outlets, claimed that from February 24, 2022 through August 19, Russia's cumulative losses included approximately 1,071,780 personnel, 31,698 artillery systems, 1,470 multiple launch rocket systems, 51,894 operational tactical UAVs, 59,060 vehicles and tankers, and 3,943 special equipment units, with an additional 890 personnel and 66 artillery systems said to be lost by Russia in the past 24 hours alone. These are colossal figures, and they land like headlines are meant to land. But any sober observer must treat wartime tallies with caution. Every side leans into its narrative. Kyiv to maintain Western support and morale, Moscow to project inevitability and control. Pro-Russian channels argue the opposite picture. That Ukrainian brigades are bleeding equipment and trained cadres faster than they can be replaced, that FPV saturation plus layered artillery has shifted the cost calculus, and that every week of failed counterpunches costs the kind of professionals that cannot be mass-produced. The truth is not a press release. It is the creeping advance around Konstantinovka, the stubborn pressure on Dobropolly's corridor, the regular pre-dawn launch cycle, and the way supply columns move or choose not to move on rutted roads. What matters is who keeps the tubes hot, who rotates companies without breaking them, and who can hide ammunition long enough to move it forward. Scott Ritter has put it another way. The battlefield is the ultimate arbiter. You can hear the sarcasm in Moscow's ecosystem when daily claims from Kyiv add up to Russian forces that should have evaporated twice over, yet the maps show something else. Likewise, you can hear the Western impatience when Russian claims of Ukrainian losses swell without photographic proof. Healthy skepticism cuts both ways. In the end, ground taken and held is the only metric that stays taken and held. Strip away the noise and the pattern is plain. Pressure at Dobropolly, methodical gains around Konstantinovka, long-range shaping before dawn, and a bet that procurement can outrun attrition. Now, let's land this. The next month turns on three levers. First, whether Ukraine can widen and secure the lifeline to Zolotoy Kolodez before Russian artillery and drones collapse it into a pocket. Second, whether the Konstantinovka front keeps yielding elevation in suburbs, forcing Kyiv to trade ground for units it cannot replace quickly. Third, whether Russia sustains the night and dawn strike rhythm, those Tu-95 MS sorties, the missile arcs, the steady harassment of rail and road, that keeps Ukrainian logistics reactive rather than proactive. Against that, Kyiv places a political industrial wager, as reported by the Financial Times. European money underwrites American weapons contracts on the scale of $100 billion, while $50 billion grows a domestic drone industry anchored by at least 10 Patriot systems to shield the grid in cities. It is a serious plan and a serious admission that this war is now about factories as much as fronts. A pro-Russian reading is not complicated. Moscow believes time and arithmetic favor its method, and it will keep slicing seams until salients crack. A fair-minded reading is also simple. Nothing in war is inevitable, and momentum can flip if logistics flip. As we close, remember the rule that Scott Ritter hammered long before this phase began. Logistics wins wars. The rest is posture. If you found this analysis useful, or if you think I am too skeptical of daily claims, tell me below. Do you want a deep dive next into the Zaporizhia axis, or a focused breakdown of how pre-dawn strikes shape air defense consumption? Your comments often decide what we do next.
Vladimir Putin apparently had a conversation with Emmanuel Macron, and he said that while Russia is not opposed to a negotiated outcome, it will have to deal with realities, including territorial reality. Russia's requirements are that all four of the Novorossiya territories, Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Lugansk, in their totality belong to Russia, and Russia will occupy all of them, including the right bank of Kherson. And because of the nefarious actions of the Ukrainians, Russia will create an appropriately sized buffer zone. And what we see happening in Sumy and in Dnipropetrovsk is Russia acting on that, meaning that they will advance until which time they have created a buffer between what will be left of sovereign Ukraine. Ukraine will not be allowed to have a common border with Russia because Ukraine has attacked Russia, and Russia is not going to allow that to happen again.
A motorcade, a handshake, and a promise of peace that sounds almost too neat. Security guarantees for Kyiv like a mini Article 5, Europeans lining up with big words, and whispers about drawing hard lines around contested territories. On the surface, everyone smiles. Underneath, this war still pays dividends for the same Western elites who never meet the draft board. Washington plays arbiter, Brussels talks sanctions number 19, and Moscow signals it will not be bullied by press conferences. Viewers, stay with me from start to finish, because tonight we cut through the choreography, follow the money, and test whether any deal on the table is real or just another photo op. As Scott Ritter has warned, Ukraine cannot win this war. It's a fantasy, according to interviews he has given since 2022. So if peace comes, it won't come from slogans, it will come from leverage and logistics. Keep watching and tell me in the comments if you think this perfect war still looks perfect once the lights go off. Let's start in Washington, where the stage is set and the guest list tells you everything. In the American capital, the choreography is deliberate, a one-on-one between President Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky, with European leaders orbiting, eager to be seen, careful not to be blamed. Publicly, Brussels vows that Ukraine must become a steel fortress with no limits on outside assistance and that a 19th sanctions package will arrive in early September. Privately, they need Washington's umbrella because without the United States, they cannot fund, arm, or sustain the effort at scale. The truth is simple. Even with Trump back in the Oval Office, the visible presidency only controls a sliver of the war machine, roughly 1/5 of what actually moves budgets, contracts, and narratives, while the permanent bureaucracy, contractors, and media ecosystems steer the rest. That is why European leaders fly in together, to nudge that 1/5 in their direction, to keep American money flowing indirectly via European taxpayers, and to make sure any peace plan still locks Russia into a box drawn in Brussels. According to European statements this week, the line is firm. Security guarantees for Kyiv first. No cap on Ukraine's armed forces and no pressure on Kyiv to cede land. This land arses line, the 7 line and Kryvyi, even as the battlefield shows a different reality. Meanwhile, Trump boasts of major progress and an envoy touts Article 5 style language, but Moscow publicly rejects any Western military footprint in Ukraine, reminding everyone that photo ops are not policy. Strip away the ceremony and you see an old story. Europe seeking American cover, America seeking European cash, and Ukraine asked to perform resilience for the cameras. If the stage is set like this, the next question is cui bono, who actually benefits from a never-ending slow-burn war? From Washington's vantage point, this conflict has been nearly perfect. Limited direct U.S. costs up front, European treasuries paying more of the bill, and defense contractors reporting healthy backlogs. For Brussels, talking sanctions replaces talking energy prices, real wages, or deindustrialization. The press conferences are cheaper than fixing policy mistakes, and for Kyiv's power brokers, the security services, political financiers, and wartime bureaucracies, constant mobilization attracts money and shields them from accountability, even as ordinary Ukrainians shoulder the sacrifice. Look at the scoreboard the mainstream admits. Ukraine has already lost roughly 1/5 of its pre-war territory. Every month of attrition drains manpower and ammunition that Europe cannot replenish at Russian scale. According to the Financial Times and other major outlets, European industry has struggled with high input costs since 2022. While Russia retools on a war footing and sources munitions at volume from friendly suppliers, the theater of sanctions looks small beside factories that deliver. This is why Scott Ritter's maxim lands. Wars are decided by logistics, not hashtags. And in a grinding contest, Russia's depth, industry, and artillery tempo matter more than summit rhetoric. So when Western officials say no concessions, what they really mean is kick the can, keep the contracts, hope the map freezes in our favor, a hope that ignores how attrition works when your side is outproduced. Which brings us to the headline claim of the week, talk of a package deal that swaps lines on the map for paper guarantees. Before we examine that, quick question for you. Do you think Western leaders are incentivized to prolong a managed war rather than close a hard deal? And if so, what would actually force them to change course? Drop your view below. Here is the rumor mill distilled. After Oval Office talks, Trump world floats a framework where Ukraine gets collective security guarantees akin to Article 5, Europeans sign on, and Russia accepts a formal no-attack commitment once a peace deal is inked. In exchange, lines would be drawn around several contested areas, with public chatter naming 5 regions: Kherson, Zaporizhia, Crimea, Sumy, and Kharkiv, though every version of this story contradicts the last about who recognizes what and where the line actually falls. An American envoy has publicly hinted at this architecture, European leaders amplify the guarantees language, and even hawkish senators concede that any real agreement requires concessions from both sides. Yet Kyiv's constitution limits its leaders' authority to concede territory, and Moscow has zero incentive to surrender gains secured at heavy cost. Notice the legal sleight of hand, calling it security guarantees without a formal NATO treaty lets Washington and Brussels claim deterrence while avoiding automatic war triggers, strong on television, weak in a crisis. Meanwhile, Moscow repeats that no Western troop presence will be tolerated and that any arrangement must reflect facts on the ground, a not subtle way of saying do not confuse press releases with power. Read it cold and you see leverage, not love. If Ukraine keeps losing ground under attrition, paper promises will not reverse the physics of artillery and industry. Only a map that reflects reality can stop the bleeding. And that is why the real pivot point lies inside Kyiv and Brussels, not on a stage, but in the political cost of admitting reality. The Kremlin's calculus is brutally rational. Continue the attrition until the other side's manpower, munitions, and politics fracture. Keep diplomatic doors open to look reasonable. Reject any Western footprint and insist that any settlement codifies what Russia already holds. From Moscow's point of view, even a small win forces the West to admit that sanctions and slogans could not move the line. A large win forces a rewiring of European security, with Washington's prestige dented and Europe more dependent. Kyiv's dilemma is harsher. Years of nationalist mobilization, legal and political constraints on any territorial compromise, and power centers that benefit from perpetual emergency make speaking plainly dangerous for incumbents. In Europe, politicians who rode a wave of moral grandstanding discover that ending a war means talking about energy, inflation, migration, and industry again, topics they have dodged for years. So the incentives line up for more theater. Declare an Article 5 style shield, announce sanctions package number 19, keep saying no limits on Ukrainian forces, and hope the audience never looks at the production schedule for shells. As Scott Ritter has put it in plain language more than once, war is not some sort of Nintendo video game. You cannot button mash your way to victory when the other side outproduces you, outranges you, and has the patience to grind. A sober, pro-peace posture today would say, freeze the line where reality demands, stop the manpower drain, rebuild lives, and let the diplomats haggle over language while the guns go quiet. That message is not glamorous, but it is honest, and it is the one path that does not treat Ukrainians and Europeans as expendable props. So if a deal comes, expect noise, claims, and spin, but judge it by one test only. Does the map stop moving? Strip away the speeches and you are left with leverage. Europe talks limitless support, Washington sells guarantees, Moscow waits behind artillery and output, and Ukraine bleeds manpower while elites manage optics. If peace is real, it will look like this. Lines drawn where force compels, a no-attack clause Moscow can live with, European money rerouted from weapons to reconstruction, and a promise that is credible precisely because it avoids theatrical tripwires. Former President Joe Biden's era normalized outsourcing costs to European taxpayers. President Donald Trump now tries to convert that into a deal he can stamp his name on. But talk is not a treaty. As Scott Ritter reminds us, Ukraine cannot win this war. It's a fantasy, a line that is not about cheering for one flag, but about refusing to waste more lives on narratives that cannot beat logistics. Viewers, are you interested in more deep dives on what a realistic, life-saving cold peace would actually require? Or do you want us to unpack how sanctions package number 19 really hits European households? Tell me below. Your comments steer the next episode.
Ukraine has shown a tremendous amount of resilience over the years. The more aggressive you are, the more casualties you take. Right now, Russia has a winning formula that minimizes Russian losses, maximizes Ukrainian losses. And Russia hasn't shown a proclivity to change that. But if Russia decides to put their pedal to the metal, they can accelerate the collapse because they create a mathematical equation which has the Ukrainians losing resources at a far greater rate than they can be replenished in it. But that's a political decision that has to be made, because to do that, you're going to increase Russian casualties at a time when the Russian government doesn't want to alter the support of the Russian people. Right now, the Russian people have steeled themselves to the reality of this conflict. They've reached an equilibrium of what kind of battlefield losses can be accepted. And I don't think that Vladimir Putin wants to change.
Tonight, we go to Russia's far east, where a new unmanned command hub in Kamchatka watches 3 seas at once and quietly rewrites the playbook. Long-endurance drones like Forepost R and Orion are now the sentries over the northern sea route and the nuclear submarine bastion near Vilyuchinsk. On the battlefield, low-cost Duran 2 aircraft have picked up an unexpected role, dropping compact PTM-3 anti-vehicle mines from above, turning logistics lanes into no-go corridors. Western headlines call it escalation, Moscow calls it efficiency. Stay with me from start to finish, because we will follow the numbers, the dates, and the hardware to see why this matters for the Arctic, the Pacific, and for a war where price and production often beat prestige. If you care about clear facts, not slogans, this is your briefing. And yes, even Scott Ritter would say the quiet part out loud. And to understand why Kamchatka is suddenly the most strategic corner of the map, we start where the drones now take off. In early August 2025, Russia's Navy stood up its first dedicated unmanned aviation control center in Kamchatka, home to the Pacific Fleet's submarine stronghold at Vilyuchinsk. The mission is plain: 24/7 surveillance along the northern sea route and tighter protection of the sea-based deterrent as the boats slip into blue water without interference. According to coverage in Kyiv Post and Izvestia, the facility coordinates reconnaissance and strike platforms, specifically Forepost R and Orion, while collating, processing, and analyzing the intelligence they collect in real time. The geography alone explains the timing. Kamchatka sits at a natural junction of the Sea of Okhotsk, the open Pacific, and the approaches to the Arctic, A true three-way gate where a few minutes of flight buys hours of visibility. Forepost R, an all-Russian upgrade of the earlier four-post line, brings a wingspan of roughly 9 meters and a length of about 6 meters. It is a 500-kilogram class aircraft that can stay aloft up to 16 hours and control out to roughly 160 kilometers, while carrying light precision stores like KAB-20 that is far beyond the tiny Orlan 10-second that weigh around 18 kilograms. Orion, meanwhile, is a 1-ton class mail system with a wingspan of about 16.3 meters, measuring 8 meters long and around 3.2 meters high. It cruises between roughly 120 and 200 kilometers per hour, can remain airborne for up to 24 hours, climbs to around 7,500 meters, and carries up to 200 kilograms of guided ordnance or sensors. Put together, that mix gives planners persistent eyes over ice lanes and choke points where submarine traffic and commercial convoys converge, exactly where Russia expects economic and security pressure to build over the coming years. With the architecture in place at the edge of the Pacific, the question becomes, can Russia feed it with enough airframes to matter week after week? Wars are won by production rhythms, not press conferences. Through late spring and early summer, Western outlets reported a steep ramp in Russia's loitering munitions output. According to The Economist, in late May 2025, daily Shahed-class production was assessed at about 100 units, with Ukrainian sources warning that the aim was to approach 500 per day. The same reporting pointed to the Alabuga complex in Tatarstan as a core node, noting an evolution from roughly 300 units per month to over 100 each day and an aspirational target of 500 daily, a shift that converts long-range strikes from episodic to routine. For any staff officer reading a map, this matters twice over. First, the drone cadence sustains round-the-clock ISR and saturation attacks without drawing on the most expensive platforms. Second, it underwrites new tactics that trade exquisite hardware for repeatable volume. That is what turns a theater from a contest of single blows into a pressure system, slow, cumulative, and brutally simple. And notice how this syncs with Kamchatka's hub. Persistent surveillance over the Arctic lanes paired with industrial-scale replenishment hardens the Pacific bastion and frees up inventory for the Ukraine front. It is the unflashy kind of advantage that commentators ignore until it shows up as fuel shortages, broken bridges, and units that arrive late to the fight. If the math is shifting from prestige to production, do you want us to dive next into how supply chains, not headlines, decide campaigns? Tell us below. On the battlefield itself, a quiet adaptation just rewired the risk map. Russian long-range Duran-2 aircraft, better known in Western media as Shahed-136, have appeared with compact cassettes slung beneath the wings to disperse PTM-3 anti-vehicle mines over roads and supply tracks. Ukrainian police and military channels first highlighted the hardware in early August after an airframe was downed in the Sumy region. Close-ups showed a PTM-3 canister and related wiring strapped to the wing. The PTM-3, described by the Geneva International Center for Humanitarian Demining, uses a battery-powered BT-06 magnetic influence fuse with a self-destruct window typically between 16 and 24 hours, making it ideal for remote scatter and short-term denial. The tactic is simple and unpleasant. Drop a handful along a logistic route at night, and even a single vehicle loss can freeze a column until engineers clear the path, time that defenders can exploit. Because Duran-2 has a nominal reach over 1,000 kilometers, even deep rear areas face a new kind of cheap, recurring hazard that does not require penetrating air defenses the way a traditional missile would. Add volume from industrial lines, and you get a persistent friction tax on movement rather than a one-off spectacle. It is the kind of asymmetric choice Russia favors. Low unit price, high cumulative effect, and minimal risk to crews. Or as analyst Scott Ritter once put it about the broader war, Russia is winning. This war is finished. Whether you agree or not, tactics like airdrop denial munitions are exactly how one side tries to make that prediction feel inevitable along the roads that matter most. And when roads slow down, armored spearheads feel it first, especially the imported ones that were supposed to change everything. The Western bet on prestige armor collided with a battlefield saturated by drones, top attack munitions, and cheap denial. By July 2025, Military Watch magazine and then the National Interest and Russia Matters roundups were amplifying an assessment that roughly 87% of the 31 M1A1 Abrams delivered had been destroyed, captured, or otherwise written off, citing 27 no longer in service. Even sympathetic observers conceded poor survivability without air cover and electronic protection. To be precise and fair, open source counts by Oryx as of early July placed visually confirmed Abrams losses significantly lower, roughly 22 out of 31 in destroyed, damaged, abandoned, or captured categories, which still aligns with the core point. The platform's cost did not translate into freedom of movement. Earlier, the Associated Press reported in April 2024 that Ukraine had sidelined the Abrams from the front because Russian drones made their operation too difficult without detection and rapid strike. In other words, the environment, not the brochure, decided outcomes. And that environment is now being shaped by the kinds of low-cost aerial tools and mine-laying adaptations we just discussed. Set against the Kamchatka hub and the production cadence out of Russia's interior, you can see the pattern: persistence, not prestige. Or, as Scott Ritter has said elsewhere, Ukraine can't win this war. It is a stark line, but the attrition math around armor and supply lines explains why voices like his resonate, especially when the data points keep pointing in the same direction. Which brings us to the bigger picture: how an Arctic gateway and a drone economy reshape strategy far from Kyiv's skyline. Put the pieces together and the logic is tight. A drone control center in Kamchatka supports 24-hour eyes along the northern sea route and the approaches to the Pacific Bastion, exactly where Russia's economy and deterrent intersect. Industrial lines move loitering munitions from special delivery to everyday stock, making it feasible to try new roles like aerial mine laying with PTM-3 that slows supply without risking crews. On the armored ledger, the numbers tell you why prestige vehicles have struggled. The air above the road is now the decisive high ground. The tone from Western coverage is slowly catching up to these realities, and the debate is no longer about slogans but about tempo, cost, and endurance. Near the end of our overview, we reference Scott Ritter by name because he forces the uncomfortable question that many in Washington and Brussels avoid. Whether you agree with his conclusions or not, his provocation spotlights the same facts we walked through tonight. In this channel, we follow the numbers and the dates, not the hashtags. If this deep dive was useful, tell us. Are you interested in a follow-up on Arctic logistics and how the northern sea route changes Asia-Europe trade? Or do you want a ground-level look at how mine clearing units adapt to PTM-3? Comment below and shape the next episode.
If at any time you thought that we said that Ukraine was going to fold over like a house of cards, especially after the initial phases of the war, I think everybody believed that Russia was going to come in and declare war on Ukraine. Had Russia declared war on Ukraine, this war would be over. But again, that's something that your question doesn't address, the difference between a special military operation and the war. I don't mean to be insulting, but don't throw a question out there unless you do your goddamn research. Nobody thought this was going to be a special military operation. That term didn't exist when this conflict began. Everybody thought that this was a war, including the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the director of the CIA, except the people that knew what was going on, the special military operation people. They understood that this wasn't a war.
The map is moving again. In the east, Russian assault groups have pushed from Predtechino to the outskirts of Konstantinovka. In the capitals, European officials whisper about security guarantees and talk of British and French troops garrisoned far from the front only after the guns fall silent. According to Bloomberg, roughly 10 countries floated the idea at the White House, while Washington ruled out sending its own troops and focused on intelligence and equipment. There is no ceasefire until a treaty is signed. That is the line repeated from Washington to Brussels. So tonight we follow the ground truth, not press releases. Even near the end of this opening, let's be clear. Former UN Inspector Scott Ritter has long warned that politics will follow the battlefield, not the other way around. Stay with me to the end and tell me in the comments whether this peace plan is strategy or stagecraft. On August 20th, 2025, multiple battlefield trackers reported that Russian Federation Armed Forces assault elements entered the southeastern outskirts of Konstantinovka after Ukraine's defensive line at Predtechino broke. The Ukrainian 93rd Independent Mechanized Brigade, already worn down by previous fights, fell back toward the city's edge. The terrain matters. A triangle bounded by the Naumica and Gruskaya rivers and the Seversky-Donets-Donbass Canal left a pocket with a formal corridor to the west of less than 3 kilometers, open on paper, but largely exposed in reality. Rather than methodically closing the pocket from Alexandro-Shultino northward, Moscow's forward echelons chose an unorthodox probe. Step into the peri-urban belt and force Kyiv to move reserves into an infantry-hungry environment. Urban and semi-urban defense soaks up manpower. One brigade already drained at Predtechino cannot comfortably hold dense streets, garden plots, and high-rise anchors all at once. The reported aim is not a dramatic storm of downtown. It is to compel redeployments, expose soft seams, and then strike those seams. To the north and northeast of nearby Chasov Yar, mapping channels logged a fresh chain of trenches taken on the western bank of the Seversky-Donets Canal, with an estimated 4.60 square kilometers added as Russian troops pushed beyond a previously fortified line and along the next shelter belt. While Ukrainian forces counterattack around the Kleban BYK reservoir line and high ground near Rusin Yar, the initiative remains with the side setting tasks for the other. As Scott Ritter has put it succinctly, the battlefield is the only metric that matters. According to battlefield monitors, that metric today tilts toward the units pushing Konstantinovka's edge, not the press briefings assuring that nothing has changed. And while the ground forces create facts, Western officials sketch a peacekeeping architecture that only begins after the shooting stops. According to Bloomberg, roughly 10 European nations told counterparts at the White House they are ready, in principle, to send troops to Ukraine, but only to train and garrison far from the front, only after hostilities cease, and only as part of a broader treaty framework that requires a green light from President Donald Trump. British and French contingents were discussed in the hundreds, not the thousands, with roles centered on training, base security, intelligence sharing, border monitoring, and perhaps layered air defense. Washington, for its part, excluded deploying American troops and kept to intelligence and equipment via partners. European defense chiefs met on August 18th to work through notional locations and force levels, while NATO's senior Europe commander and several defense ministers were cited as likely participants in follow on talks about strong security guarantees. It sounds tough, but listen closely to the verbs train, garrison, prepare, share. This is political scaffolding meant to signal resolve without changing the battlefield's math. It risks creating a post-conflict tripwire that looks impressive on paper and does little if the firing starts again. For Kyiv, the message is bittersweet. Sustained Western kit and advisors may continue, but no American boots. For Moscow, the message is clearer. Once a treaty exists, Europeans will plant flags in safe areas, not on contested ridgelines. The strategy's soft underbelly is deterrence credibility. If the contingent size stays in the low hundreds and their mission remains non-combat, then any future crisis becomes a test of whether European capitals would escalate or evacuate. Meanwhile, as officials debate acronyms, the front does not wait. The eastern sector keeps grinding forward a few kilometers of tree line and spoil pile at a time, the kind of unglamorous progress that never makes a podium but decides negotiations later. Gentle satire aside, the gap between podium language and trench reality is the story. Question for viewers: do you think this European security presence after a treaty would meaningfully change the balance, or is it a costly photo op? Tell me below what part of the plan you want us to unpack next. To gauge whether the paper plan matches the soil, we follow the yardage being cut from Chasov Yar down to Seversk and further north. The northeastern shoulder of the Konstantinovka fight links directly to activity around Chasov Yar and the canal. Battlefield mapping accounts recorded the capture of trenches and shelters along the western bank of the Seversky Donets Canal and movement into the next shelter belt, with the new wedge measured at approximately 4.60 square kilometers. Further north, on the Seversk axis, reports indicated Russian troops took most, if not all, of Serebryanka's remaining blocks, raised flags at the western fringe, and forced Ukrainian elements to withdraw to nearby tactical high ground. The shift there was estimated at 1.87 square kilometers. On the Borova approach, the picture is one of dual-pronged pressure. From Zeleny High in the south, units pushed through a ravine, secured a patch of dense woodland, and the northern end of 3 parallel shelter belts. From the north, they bit into the northern face of a defensive arc running toward Borivska and Drivka. The day's cumulative addition there was put at 8.16 square kilometers. On the Kramatorsk line, incremental gains were logged north of Poltavka and around Vladimirovka, while Ukrainian defense in the Kucherov Yar area reportedly rotated in Azov formations to stiffen the sector. In Kupiansk, Russian units were said to have edged into central districts and to be holding positions on the eastern side of the urban core with ongoing engagements. None of this is glamorous, but all of it is consequential. The common denominator is attrition, shelter belt to shelter belt, quarry berm to quarry berm, a pattern that rewards sustained logistics and punishes flamboyant press claims. That is why Scott Ritter's other blunt line keeps showing up in staff briefings. Logistics win wars. You can brief whatever number you like at a lectern. If you cannot move ammunition, rotate battalions, and repair armor on schedule, tree lines will decide your reality. This is where light satire is earned. The most energetic Western declarations often arrive precisely when the map tilts the other way. The ground rewards batteries and bulldozers, not podiums. With the line lengthening and reserves tied down, the real question is what Moscow chooses next at Konstantinovka: encircle, pierce, or pause and bleed the sector. Commanders looking at Konstantinovka can sketch 2 clean arrows and a messier reality. Option 1 is the textbook squeeze. build pressure north of Alexandro Shultino while pushing south from Predtekino, and narrow the western corridor below that already thin less than 3-kilometer band, pocketing Ukrainian elements east of the Naumika and Gruskaya and along the canal. Option 2 is what the forward detachments just signaled. Maintain direct pressure on the city's fringes to force Kyiv to commit infantry into street grids and private plot labyrinths where defenders need many more rifles per block. The 8th Guards Army's effort west of the Kleban BYK reservoir, fighting for the heights around Rusin Yar and the road between Artyom, also called Dolgaya Balka, and Artyomovka, also referred to as Sofievka, fits the encirclement logic. Pushing near Stepanovka and securing Keystone Knolls multiplies pressure without expending battalions in high-rise assaults. Meanwhile, on the northeastern arc, steady bites near the chalk quarries and the canal blunt counterattacks and tilt the geometry further. Kyiv's answer has been to hold fortifications, siege approaches, and counterpunch where possible. Katerinovka, paths toward Kleban BYK, and the Sherbanovka line all saw activity, while rotating units to keep frontage manned. But the broader strategic context matters, as European officials talk about post-war garrisons and as Washington limits itself to intelligence and equipment. President Donald Trump's position is clear: no American troops, no ceasefire until a treaty, and a preference to let a negotiated text follow battlefield facts. That posture, combined with European caution, signals to Moscow that time and yardage may be more valuable than headlines. The sober pro-Russia reading is simple: avoid costly urban set pieces, keep grinding the shoulders, and make the next political round accept the map as it is, not as press rooms imagine it. Which brings us to the only place strategy and politics actually meet: how these cumulative gains shape the coming treaty talk. According to multiple public briefings, there will be no ceasefire until a treaty is signed. According to Bloomberg's reporting, about 10 European governments are preparing a post-conflict security footprint of trainers and garrisons far from the front, while the United States limits itself to intelligence and material. On the ground, the Russian side expanded control by roughly 4.60 square kilometers near the canal by Chasov Yar, about 1.87 near Serebryanka, and approximately 8.16 near Borova, pressed into Kupiansk's eastern center, and put direct pressure on Konstantinovka after Predtekino's line failed. The strategic message is not complicated. The side banking yardage will dictate the clauses. Near the end of this program, let's name it again: Scott Ritter, because his core warning frames the moment politics will conform to the battlefield's arithmetic. Skepticism is healthy whenever casualty numbers or miracle counterstrikes are read from a podium. The map, the logistics, and the pace of rotation remain the only durable truth. If you found this breakdown useful, tell me in the comments. Are you interested in a deeper dive on the proposed British and French deployments? Or do you want a sector-by-sector explainer on Konstantinovka's urban approach? Your questions shape what we cover next.